Welcome back to the National Training Center's Acid Rock Drainage Training Course. With me again is Harry Posey from the Colorado Division of Minerals and Geology, same place you worked from this morning.
That's right.
And with us now for the first time is Jim Gusick. Jim is a mining engineer with Knight Piésold, a major consulting company for the mining industry. Jim has experience with acid drainage mitigation in several countries. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Dave. I hope my segment will more or less tie all the information that we've seen so far together and find a way to both prevent and mitigate acid rock drainage.
Oh, great. That'll be good. We've got time now for questions. If you've got questions on this morning's segments, go ahead and give us a call. If you've got questions stored up, the number should be on the screen. Go ahead and call that number and we'll try and answer your questions. Since there are no immediate questions, Jim will pick us up on mitigation, so go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Dave. Well, at this point in the broadcast, you should be familiar with what causes acid rock drainage and how to predict that it'll form. In the next few minutes, we'll use these concepts to focus on preventing ARD and eventually treating the minimum amount of ARD that remains. So this block of the program is divided into three segments. ARD prevention measures that can be implemented at planned, active, and abandoned mines, control measures to collect and manage the ARD once it's formed, and lastly, both active and passive treatment methods to address the ARD that could ultimately migrate off-site and impact water sources. Now, let's talk about preventing ARD. Here's the old ARD tetrahedron again, and let's take a minute here to fill in the blanks that are missing. And while you're filling in the blanks, I'd like to reiterate that disrupting this geochemical relationship is the keystone to ARD prevention. First things we may want to do is to cut off the pyrite. We may want to cut off the oxidizers. We may want to cut off the water or cut off the bacteria. All of these things would really be helpful in alone or in combination in preventing ARD from forming. But of the four ARD components in the tetrahedron to target, the easiest to address is probably water exclusion. That's why the word water is highlighted here. Oxidizers are a little bit more difficult to control, and pyrite, being the keystone of ARD formation, is fixed by the geology of the site, as Ginger and everybody else on the team has talked about earlier. And controlling bacteria is possible, but it's really only a temporary fix. So why is water so important? Many mineral processing operations use lots of water. This ranges from the heap leaching, where recirculated solutions dissolve gold, to conventional mills where rock water mixtures or slurries are found. A lot of water is tied up in the mine waste themselves after the processing, and the subsequent rainfall can add to it. One way to combat ARD is to minimize the storage of water in the wastes. The old mining adage to store solids, not water, is especially appropriate because water is so difficult to control once it's been contaminated. Thus, any process that drains water or dries out the waste is ultimately beneficial. While ARD prevention per se seems to imply active or future mining operations, it's important to note that the concept is applicable at abandoned mine lands, especially despite the likely situation that ARD has already well established. This slide shows where we're headed in this segment on prevention. One prime ARD prevention technique that's been successful is encapsulation, which can be employed at a number of different levels. From a macroscopic level that includes covers and caps and waste submergence, down to the chemical level where individual grains of pyrite or sulfide are coated or treated in ways that inhibit the oxidation process. So which ones are the best? There's no clear answer because every site situation is different. Water controls include diversions of both surface water and groundwater, and the active ingredient in the commercial bactericide for ARD control is sodium lauryl sulfate, a common soap ingredient. You probably used it this morning when you took a shower. We'll discuss additives and amendments in more detail, but this approach can be problematic when you consider the huge volumes of mine waste at a typical metal mine site. For this approach to be economical, the amendment has to be free or inexpensive and close by to minimize transportation costs. Let's talk about macro encapsulation first. What do you need to encapsulate? All of the waste or just some of it? here's where all the prediction and characterization work that we talked about earlier really comes to bear. Mining typically involves the generation or excavation and movement of large volumes of waste. Unfortunately, it's pretty easy for these wastes to mix in this situation. However, with a little bit of planning, really problematic wastes can be segregated from the benign wastes so that encapsulation cost and effort can be minimized. But what about abandoned mines? Sometimes reprocessing and remining the waste might yield a saleable byproduct that might offset some of the remediation cost. So once the waste mass is identified, a cap might be constructed over it. If possible, a liner might be used to isolate the waste from the groundwater or vice versa. Flooding of the waste is a viable means of encapsulation. In this case, air contact with the mine waste is avoided. This technique is especially viable for fresh wastes that have not had a chance to oxidize. But for this to work in perpetuity, total and permanent submergence is required. Now let's talk about soil covers. Generally speaking, there are three types of soil covers, one for dry climates and a second for wet climates. The third is the organic barrier that might be appropriate in either climatic situation. The focus of the first two is water exclusion. But organic barriers have been successful in minimizing oxygen exposure of tailings and other mine waste as well. The decaying organic matter consumes the oxygen and thus prevents pyrite oxidation, or cutting off a leg of that ARD tetrahedron there. But in order for an organic barrier to be practical, a large supply of relatively inexpensive source material must be available. Sewage sludge, unfortunately, is not a good source, but forestry waste, wood chips, sawdust, that's a safe bet. So let's take a look at the moisture retention evapotranspiration cover. Just from its name, you can guess how it works to keep moisture away from the waste. The first key feature is a sloping surface to promote runoff, but too much of a steepness can cause erosion. As we saw in Dave's tour of the Golden Sunlight Mine, 2-to-1 slopes can be workable. The bench faces may have steepened slopes, but the overall slope of the cover, the better. The second feature is the mass of soil or earth that covers the waste and stores the moisture that doesn't run off. That's this big mass here. This doesn't have to be topsoil. It can be oxide waste that stores the moisture that the plant roots and capillary suction can pull to the surface. Again, they used oxide waste at Golden Sunlight. If the mine waste is a wet tailings, you may need to include a capillary break to avoid, right here, to avoid salt buildup in the plant growth layer. A veneer of topsoil or growth media is typically required though. Plants on the surface are an integral part of this design as they help to wick out the soil, wick out the moisture from the cap and either bind it into the plant tissue or release it to the atmosphere. This design works best in arid climates and is not appropriate in wet climates because the poor rates of evapotranspiration that are typically found there. Note the lack of an impermeable clay barrier layers. Under low humidity, these desiccate and crack. Storing the moisture and letting it run off is the key to preventing it from infiltrating into the waste and forming ARD. The infiltration barrier cap works well in wet and temperate climates, and as you can see, it has several different layer types that may be needed. Now it too relies on a sloping surface to promote runoff and a soil layer to promote evapotranspiration. But the main component of the cap that protects the mine waste is the barrier soil or the geomembrane. Now if a barrier soil is used, it will probably have a high percentage of clay in order to develop low permeability. Again, this component will not work in a dry climate because the clay will tend to dry out, crack, and the sealing ability of the layer will be lost. The lateral drainage layer is another key feature of the infiltration barrier cap. Right in here. It keeps the hydraulic head on the clay or geomembrane liner low, and this helps to control the infiltration through the barrier layer. The lateral drainage layer can either be sand or gravel or a plastic composite of geonet and geofabric. As you might expect, the construction of an infiltration barrier cap is complicated and expensive, relying a lot on quality assurance observation to make sure that the cap is installed correctly. The design of soil covers can be guided by a free computer model, the Hydraulic Evaluation of Landfill Performance, or HELP model, that is available on the web. This was developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But the HELP model only addresses the physical performance of a cover system with respect to water. It does not address the geochemistry of the leachate. Soil and organic material caps can work well to keep water and air away from ARD wastes. But somewhat paradoxically, water can be used to keep air away from mine waste as well, and thus disrupt a different leg of the ARD tetrahedron, the air leg. It doesn't take much, as little as 3 feet of standing water, to suppress oxygen transfer that supports pyrite oxidation. There are 2 general mining situations that might work to implement such a flooding control measure: subaqueous tailings deposition and underground mine adit plugging. This flooding technique works well on tailings, which are often placed as a slurry anyway. However, submergence has to occur quickly after the waste is placed, ideally within a week to a month of the waste's generation. This timing prevents the generation of sulfur salts that upon submersion would produce ARD. These were talked about a lot this morning. It's important to make sure that the submergence is permanent. Periodic drying and re-wetting is the worst possible situation and must be avoided completely to make this particular methodology work. Tailings submergence may be an acceptable method to control ARD in the majority of tailings basins, but the conditions in the tailings impoundment or the dam itself are typically not conducive to total flooding. Tailings dam stability might be compromised by high water tables necessary to keep the main body of tailings underwater. Thus, a tailings dam failure and the subsequent devastation associated with it would be a high price to pay to implement a flooded tailings basin scenario for ARD control. So, you really do need to consider the geotechnical consequences of implementing this technique before you go ahead with it. Many abandoned mines are drained by tunnels that provide a constant loading of ARD on a watershed. This cross-section layout of a typical hard rock tunnel shows some of the effects of intentional flooding as a remedy for ARD. Here's the plug right here. Plugging adits is a special case of ARD waste flooding that needs to be considered very carefully. The sulfur salts and byproducts of pyrite oxidation will be typically present back in the old mine workings and could create a large mine pool with ARD characteristics unless there's a source of alkalinity to counteract it. As the mine workings fill with water behind an engineered plug, a number of potential problems can surface, especially uncontrolled leaks through fractures and leakage higher up and around the plug itself. A hydraulic analysis is needed to determine the most likely spill points that might develop as the mine plugs, where it could flow out and escape. Seasonal fluctuations in the mine pool may also cause problems with the wetting and drying of ARD-prone wall rocks. The plug site also needs to be carefully considered. The geostatic head, which is the distance above the plug to the ground surface, needs to be greater than the anticipated hydrostatic head, which is the head on the mine pool itself, behind the plug, or hydrofracturing will occur and the plug could fail. Indeed, mine flooding is a mitigation option that should not be approached lightly. There are lots of different additives that can be used to disrupt the ARD tetrahedron. These are alkalinity adjusters like limestone and lime. Organic reagents can be mixed in with the water and injected using a patented process to promote specific bacterial reactions, and other reagents that can micro-encapsulate the pyrite grains. Before you commit to using this approach, consider the volume of mine waste that needs treatment and the physical situation at the site. Additives might not be practical if the mine waste facility measures in the millions and millions of tons in size. Injection of liquid additives may require good hydrogeologic or hydrologic control of the solutions. In general, these approaches need to dovetail with other ARD control measures to be successful over the long term. Sodium lauryl sulfate is a proven bactericide for Thiobacillus ferrooxidans, but by itself it's very soluble and can be washed away pretty easily. However, there are commercially available products to deliver it in slow doses to allow nearly continuous bacterial control. But the effects aren't permanent, and especially after the sodium lauryl sulfate product is depleted. So bactericide should be combined with other ARD tetrahedron disrupting techniques to get control of an ARD situation. An interesting case history involves the injection of a sodium hydroxide solution, which counteracted the pyrite acidity, and a bactericide through boreholes at an 8-acre revegetated coal waste site. I'm sorry, I had to bring in this coal site, Dave. That had some ARD hotspots. These had been identified using geophysical techniques. This site in Pennsylvania had an acidic seep with pH 5 to 6 at the base of the dump. With lime addition to the discharge, a small wetland was able to treat the flow. A solution of 20% sodium hydroxide was pumped into the wells, followed by the injection of a 2% strength bactericide. Within a month after the injection event, the chemistry of the seep had improved to the point that the constructed wetland alone could provide treatment. The lime addition wasn't needed anymore. And today, about 6 years later, the water quality in that seep has not deteriorated and the wetland continues to function as intended. This concludes this segment on prevention of ARD. I hope you remember that the ARD tetrahedron can be disrupted in a number of different ways and that more than one will typically be needed to get control of a particular situation. And the arsenal of ideas I presented hopefully has armed you with some of the practical concepts on preventing ARD. At this point, Harry, I believe you've got some information for everyone on upland diversions.
Thanks, Jim. Upland diversions are perhaps one of the simplest means to minimize the effects of mining impacted waters. They can also be one of the least expensive measures. The purpose of an upland diversion is simply to minimize the amount of surface water that can enter the acid generating rock, or to ferry the water around that rock. If you limit the amount of water going into the rock, then automatically you limit the amount of water coming out, and thereby you'll have reduced the metals and the acid load. There's a slide here that shows an example of an upland diversion ditch. This particular ditch is a concrete lined ditch, fairly simple construction. The ditch is that white line and on the bottom of the diagram, and also on the right hand side of the diagram, and we're actually standing several tens of feet above a large waste rock dump, and the water is flowing from, say, my feet toward that ditch, and then it's supposed to flow across the waste rock. But the concrete line ditch here will intercept that water and move it around the waste rock pile and keep a lot of the water out of the waste rock pile. Like all ditches, it's going to need some occasional clearing. It's going to need some maintenance, but it's pretty good and it could last for quite a while. The concrete itself, in acid cases, can prevent some acidification because it dissolves and it can neutralize some of the acid waters. Here's another slide. This is an example of two types of ditch. In this next slide, we're looking down a ditch. We have one type of ditch in the foreground and another type in the background. The near ditch is lined with riprap, fairly coarse here, kind of boulder size, and the far ditch, the green part, is lined with a jute mat. In a year or so, that jute mat may cover over with grass and soil, and it'll look more like the native landscape. That grass cover will help prevent erosion, and just by capturing the water and allowing it to move on. The riprap liner is needed in streams where you have a high stream gradient, where the erosion potential is high. But the grass-lined ditch can be laid down where the gradient is lower and where the erosion potential is low. The grass-lined ditches are probably more for overland flow than down the ditch kind of flow. But the riprap ditches are really meant to work as a ditch to convey the water perpendicular to or at a steep gradient. This next slide here shows how the ditch liners are constructed. At the base of this particular ditch, the ditch has been dug into native material, and the native material in this case is composed of soil, but also a fair bit of rock. The synthetic membrane that lies above that rock would probably break under the load, and so this membrane is not really meant to contain all of the water. It's just meant to help convey it, because the rocks are pretty jagged. In fact, the black membrane in this diagram is actually a fine mesh. Now above that black mesh, you can place either rock or the jute map, or maybe even the concrete. Now these ditches, they're not rocket science. They can go in fairly fast. They can be fairly low maintenance. But the main thing about them is that they have to pass the design event. They ought to be able to withstand erosion from the much larger events. So back to you, Jim.
Yep, let me interrupt for just a second. We do have a fax that came in from Dennis Turner, and I'm not sure we have exactly the right people on here to answer this, but we'll go ahead and we'll wade into it. What Dennis says is, I would like to hear your panel's ideas on controlling acid drainage in arid environments, for example, the desert Southwest, Andean environment, Australian outback / Western Australia. The answer should address methods used in prediction specific to arid environments, proven methods, addressing acid drainage at closure, both prediction and control, planning for closure to avoid acid drainage, any other specialized concerns unique to arid environments, for example, neutral drainage, may last longer before converting to acid. Who wants to handle what part of this?
That's a tall order.
I think he needs to come back tomorrow for the session.
Good dodge and weave. Let's look at the first one again. Go to the top.
Methods used in prediction specific to arid environments. I guess I would say probably any of the normal characterization methods that we use routinely would work for predicting, what the likelihood of acid drainage is. The main difference in arid environments is the availability of water, both as a reactant and as a transport agent.
Now, would you change the, say, the humidity cell test or any of the other tests to reflect a more humid, or a less humid environment? Or
I probably wouldn't change the test, but you'd have to interpret them differently.
Correct. Okay.
And then addressing acid drainage at closure.
I think that goes back to the evapotranspiration ET type of cover, which is relying on the storage of water that comes down. What we're trying to avoid here is the rainstorm event that allows water to infiltrate into the waste rock. And at this point, you'd have to size the thickness of that storage layer above the waste, so that the moisture content, the maximum moisture content of that layer, contains at least a year or maybe more of the average rainfall that would normally fall on the site. Even if it falls all at once, you design the cap so most of it runs off, but you're not going to let all of it run off. Some of it's going to soak in, and you want it to soak in to allow to keep your plants growing, because they're part of the ET process. They help to pull the water out of that moisture retention cap, the ET type cap. So that's the type of cap that would normally be used, let's say, in an arid environment.
I guess one thing I'd add to that is, in my experience in arid environments, is some people tend to think that because it never rains, they don't have to consider surface water control as seriously as an area where you get more precipitation. But in fact, often in arid environments, it may not rain much, but when it rains, look out, it's going to rain hard. So actually, in some cases, you actually need to be more careful about how you plan for surface water control.
Do we have another third part?
Let's see. Planning for closure to avoid acid drainage. I mean, that's just, to some extent, that's just incorporating the things that we've just talked about.
Well, I think we have to start thinking like a miner at this point. And one of the things that, say, a mining company or the mining engineers on site have to start thinking about, where am I going to get this 4-foot or 3-foot thick cap material. Where am I going to find this oxide waste? And when you start thinking about mine planning, you're going to be excavating a pit and you're going to run into this oxide material first. And where is it going to go? It's going to go on the bottom of a waste rock dump, and subsequently it might get buried. So the actual waste management has to become a part of the mine plan, where you say, okay, I'm going to need 4 feet of this cover when I'm done, so I better start stockpiling that material and not putting it in a place that I can't effectively recover it at the end of the mine life and do that economically. And that's got to become part of the mine planning. You actually have to plan for closure, and where am I going to get these materials? And this could even change during the mine life, where, gee, we found more reserves, we've got an extra 20 years of mine life, but that doesn't mean that the overall requirements of closure are going to be delayed or changed. You have to incorporate the changes in the ore reserves with the changes in, call it the closure reserves. How are you going to close this thing out?
Yeah. We'll ask any other specialized concerns unique to acid environments. For example, neutral drainage may last longer before converting to acid. Yeah, I mean,
I think at this point, if it's going to go acid, you have to just plan for that and assume that if it's going to go that way eventually, you might as well just, there's no reason to cut back on the cover or the cover designs or any of the other things in the long term.
Yeah.
I think, too, one of the things to consider is, and thanks, Dennis, by the way, for that question. One of the things to consider is that you're not going to have a lot of vegetation in your extremely arid environments. We get a lot of advantage out of vegetation cover. It helps to store water for the short term, for the short-term events, and that advantage is going to not be there for the extremely arid environments. So it's good to plan your caps to exclude any benefit that you would ordinarily plan for in the more humid environments.
Thanks, guys. I think it's back to you, Jim.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Dennis. At this point, we've just discussed how to prevent ARD from forming, but it's unlikely that ARD can be totally stopped in every situation. So now we're going to move on to discussing methods of controlling the movement of ARD that is formed despite all of our best efforts at prevention. We've divided this segment into discussions addressing surface water and groundwater. Collecting surface water that's contaminated with ARD is pretty straightforward. Some of the diversion ditches that Harry talked about could be used easily. And these ditches could be used to direct ARD into holding ponds and sumps for transferring to treatment facilities, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But diversion ditches can also be used to keep a small volume of bad water from mixing with a large volume of good water. Now, most of you may not have heard of subaerial tailings deposition. This is a special case concept that allows tailings to better shed water, especially works well in arid environments. And while it may be considered an encapsulation method, I've included it here as a surface water diversion technique. So, what is subaerial tailings deposition? A few minutes ago, we talked about subaqueous tailings deposition, which is loosely defined as the placement of tailings underwater, subaqueous. As you might guess from the name then, subaerial tailings deposition is the placement of tailings under air, or in thin lifts. Subaerial tailings deposition is a special case of surface water diversion. The goal is to produce a tailing surface that is so compact and impermeable that surface water during operation and post-closure runs off and does not infiltrate into the tailings to form ARD. In essence, the tailings are placed in such a dense condition that they behave almost like a cap. In this method, tailings are placed in thin lifts in a rotational system as shown on this illustration. We'll discuss the dynamics of it in a minute, but placing the tailings, rotating along the zones of, say, Zone A, we may deposit there for a week, and then stop depositing in Zone A, and then deposit in Zone B for a week, and then rotate and deposit in Zone C for a week. And in the meantime, Zone A is dropping out, or is drying out, and Zone B is drying out, and so on. And basically, this allows the water in the tailings slurry to be extracted, creating a very dense mass that just naturally sheds water. This is what a subaerial tailings facility looks like in the field. Note the active deposition along this line right here, and the tailings are flowing down into the supernatant pond, the decant pond right here, which is relatively small compared to the tailings mass, which is very large. The tailings are placed through drop bars, which are right here, which basically dissipate the energy out of the tailings slurry, and it's deposited in this thin lift. And after a specific deposition zone is completed, and this zone actually dries out, tension cracks form. As you can see in this part of the slide here, these tension cracks form, and the solids are they're dense enough to walk on. And this can occur within a week after deposition stops because we put it down in thin lifts. Now this next slide shows the general sequence of events from stage 1 slurry deposition down to stage 4, where the evaporation pulls out the remaining moisture from the tailings mass. In each case, we're pulling water out either through just supernatant settling and through drainage. We're getting rid of water, and finally we're evaporating it, and the density of the material is decreasing slowly down to a very dense, dry, compact mass that's just ready for closure. And again, we've stopped depositing, say, today, and a week from now, we can start building a cap. We do not have to wait sometimes for many, many years for the tailings mass to dry out, as with subaqueous tailings deposition situations. So at stage 4, the tailings are very dense, and more important, they're much more impermeable. Thus, when exposed to a rainstorm event, much of the precipitation runs off and reports to the decant pond. Thus, this tailing technique, this placement technique, enhances the ability of tailings to self-protect themselves against surface water migration into the tailings mass. But more importantly, the tailings are relatively dry and ready for almost immediate covering with a cap structure. So now let's move on to groundwater controls. There are two primary control methods I like to introduce: French drains and slurry cutoff walls. The French drain acts by providing a preferential pathway for groundwater to follow, and a slurry cutoff wall is a barrier to groundwater that can be used to contain ARD in a pre-selected zone of an aquifer. The goal of this structure is to collect seepage along a dispersed area and funnel it to a specific single point that can be diverted to a treatment facility. So here are two examples of French drains. The one on the right shows the basic construction. We have a ditch. In this case, it's excavated into tailings, and we have a geotextile material placed in the bottom, and then the French drain is backfilled with coarse rock, and then the edges of the geotextile are folded back over, and then the whole drain is covered. Now, it allows water to pass through it, but this geotextile acts as a filter to keep the surrounding soil out of the coarse rock. Sometimes you'll see perforated pipes included in the design, right in the middle. When controlling ARD seepage, it's important to select a coarse rock that's compatible with the ARD chemistry. The second example on the left illustrates this point. This is a discharge end of a French drain in a mine waste facility. It may be difficult to see, but there's a lot of iron staining going on right in this part. At this site, limestone was used as the coarse rock in the French drain. Now, if this ARD had contained dissolved aluminum hydroxide would have formed, filling up the pore spaces and filling between the rocks and plugging up the drain. So remember, unless you design for it, and you may want to, the coarse rock in a French drain should be non-reactive with the ARD. So don't use limestone unless you really want to do something entirely different. Slurry trenches are basically dams or impermeable walls that are located just below the surface of the ground. These features, if keyed into a bedrock unit that is impermeable, can control the flow of groundwater in a shallow aquifer. As the native material in the trench is excavated and it is replaced with a slurry of soil and clay, which is usually bentonite, that forms the barrier to groundwater flow. The slurry also provides resisting pressure that prevents the sides of the trench from collapsing. Trench depths may vary from several tens of feet to over 100 feet, and trench width is usually about 2 to 3 feet. Slurry trenches are typically constructed with a backhoe or a similar excavator as shown on the screen here. When the trench will be exposed to ARD, the clay soil slurry is typically prepared using the actual ARD that will be encountered on site. In this way, the geochemistry of the slurry trench mass is conditioned for eventual ARD contact. There are other ways to control groundwater contaminated by ARD. One that might come to mind is sheet piling. Unfortunately, the corrosive nature of ARD would quickly destroy sheet piles which are not very watertight to start with. And these other secondary migration control techniques can get very expensive for the larger sites, and the technologies border almost on treatment. However, they might be employed in concert with slurry trenches or French drains as we just described. So this segment of the program should have provided you with a foundation knowledge of the techniques to collect and direct ARD after it is formed, whether it's occurring as groundwater or surface water. You can also apply these techniques to keep ARD from mixing with sources of good water or to promote runoff, as in the case of subaerial tailings deposition. You should also remember to consider the geochemical reactions that might occur when selecting construction materials. So that concludes our discussion of ARD migration technologies. So next, after all the prevention and control measures have been implemented, you've got to be prepared to treat the residual ARD in perpetuity. The universe of treatment options ranges from active, passive, and combination systems. When we think of active treatment of ARD, we typically think of the addition of chemicals. When we think of passive treatment, we typically think of constructed wetlands. In this segment, I'll discuss all kinds of treatment techniques and some of the information you need to decide which ones might be the best to use. There will be more focus on passive treatment because it seems to be the long-term treatment process of choice for the mining industry in many state, government, and federal agencies. Now, there are 5 key ARD treatment issues that really influence what might be feasible at a given site. The land surface. A passive system typically requires more land surface area than an active system. This could be driven by permit boundaries, land ownership, or topography. System longevity and maintenance may be key issues at really remote sites. For example, how often do you need to have people on site to maintain or operate the treatment system? Now, passive treatment techniques are low maintenance, but remember, they're not no maintenance. And what about sludge? How will it be disposed of? A lot of factors can influence this, and too many of them, we just can't name them right now. Will the treatment system perform to design criteria? Big question here. What happens when Mother Nature throws in an El Nino storm? Do you bypass the storm flow or try to treat 100% of the time? That could get pretty expensive. But all of the above will influence costs, but you need to balance the trade-offs in capital cost versus operating cost and look at the life cycle costs of treatment. And studies have shown that life cycle costs of passive treatment are about half those of active treatment. There are 3 basic alternatives available for ARD treatment. The first 2 might be familiar to you, but combination systems also should be considered. Often, a passive treatment system might provide polishing of a passive system might provide polishing of an active treatment effluent that would be difficult to achieve by active treatment alone. So what are the main metal removal mechanisms we might expect in a typical treatment system? The 3 major ones here that we're showing here are chemical, and the 4th is a physical mechanism. The first chemical method is through hydroxide and oxide precipitation, and this can be facilitated by the Thiobacillus ferro-oxidans bacteria and other species. Another major mechanism is sulfate and carbonate precipitation facilitated by sulfate-reducing bacteria, or SRB. Carbonate dissolution and chemical neutralization rounds out the big three chemical treatment methods. Now, the above methods create precipitates, so filtering is an important part of an overall performance of the system. Some of the minor metal mechanisms might surprise you in regards to passive treatment, especially metal uptake into plants. Remarkably, plant uptake only accounts for maybe 10% of total metal removal. Plants provide other benefits, but metal removal plays only a minor role. Adsorption and exchange can occur in these systems, but the four mechanisms we'd introduced on the previous slide typically predominate. In other words, a typical passive treatment cell is nothing but a bioreactor with a green toupee. So what data do you need to design a treatment system, whether it's active or passive? My friends have already discussed the various characteristics of ARD, so we won't belabor that topic. But let's take a minute to think about why would both flow rate and water chemistry be important to design a system. Well, you may have answered, well, you need the flow rate to size the pipes in the ponds. But there's more to it than that. I'd like to introduce the concept of loading here. Loading is the product of flow rate times the metal concentration, and the product is typically expressed as a mass per unit time, like pounds or grams per day or kilograms of metal per year. And it's important in the design process because it's used to determine the amounts of chemicals required to treat the ARD in case of an active system, or it can be used to determine the size or area extent of a passive treatment system. And it can also be used as a yardstick to evaluate just how well an ARD remediation measure is working. Before we get to working on some loading examples, let's take a minute to consider some of the ways that flow rates can be determined. Perhaps you can think about some others that you've used in the field. And no, asking the site manager is not a valid answer. So fill in the gaps. Well, how did you do? Here are the answers. Let's take a minute to talk about them. Now, there are lots of different types of inflow pipe meters available, and they apply to both pipes flowing full and partially full. But they generally need electricity to work. Well, how about the bucket and stopwatch? Did you get that one? This is probably the best way to measure very low flows like those coming out from ARD seeps. You may need to divert the flow into a pipe so that you can get a bucket under it. We'll see a picture of a V-notch weir here in a minute, as well as a rectangular weir. These structures allow you to mathematically relate the flow depth, which is pretty easy to measure, to a flow rate. But weirs can plug up with sediment. So there are lots of types of flumes, which are somewhat better than weirs, that are less likely to plug. My favorite is the H flume, which is pretty accurate over a wide range of flow rates. And the vane velocity meter can also be used with the cross-sectional area of the stream to let you calculate a flow rate, which is the area times the velocity. And this last technique is pretty crude. You estimate the flow velocity with a floating stick and couple that with the cross-section area of the stream to arrive at a flow rate. So let's look at some of these structures in the field, see what they look like. Here's a V-notch weir measuring flow diverted from an underground mine shaft. It's pretty easy to get a sampling point. Here's a broad-crested rectangular weir tied into a spillway from a reservoir. Here's a fiberglass H-flume that was installed in an underground mine portal. The flow at this site ranged from about 15 gallons a minute to over 600 gallons per minute. It's made out of fiberglass. Here's a cutthroat flume installed on a natural stream, and it's made of concrete. So now that we understand how to measure flow rates of ARD, let's take a look at an example of a loading calculation. Here we have a flow rate of 8 gallons per minute and an iron concentration of 20 milligrams per liter. We need to know how many grams of iron are produced per day because it will drive the size of a constructed wetland we want to design. You'll note that a portion of the calculation is devoted to converting English to metric units. On the bottom of the screen, we've converted the math to a single conversion factor, about 5.5. So, how can we use this information? We've got 872 grams of iron per day. If the ARD in this example had enough net alkalinity, a constructed wetland based on a standard rule of thumb would yield a design footprint of about 1,000 square feet. So if the loading were 10 times as high, or 8,700 grams of iron per day, the wetland would need to be proportionately bigger, 10 times. So let's do another exercise. In this case, we have two sets of flow and water quality data for a seep from a waste rock dump, both before and after the installation of a cap. First, calculate the loadings for iron and use those to figure out the loadings for iron, and use those two numbers to figure out how much the cap reduced the loading from the source. And this is the amount we're going to have to treat. So please give this a try. We'll be back in a couple of minutes and see how you did. Okay, let's see how you did. Well, first let's take a look at the math. Now, before the cap was installed, the waste rock dump was producing about 13,625 grams of iron per day. That's 50 milligrams per liter times 50 gallons per minute times our conversion factor to get 13,625. Now, after the cap installation, where iron was 10 milligrams per liter, and 5 gallons per minute was the flow, we've cut down on the water flow, we've developed 273.5 grams of iron per day. Now what happened here? What we had was the iron oxidation slowed down so that we reduced the iron in the iron concentration in the water from 50 down to 10. So our oxidation is slowed down, and our cap prevented the water going through the mine waste from 50 gallons per minute down to 5. And those are reasonable numbers. But what happens when you combine those two? If you divide the 273.5 by the 13,625, it appears that the loading was decreased down to 2% of the original amount just by installing the cap. So a cap can go a long way at preventing ARD. On your own, if you like, you can calculate the zinc loading and see how those overall numbers compare. And they're very, very similar. So now that we know how to calculate loading, let's take a look at active treatment technologies. But before we do, we may have a question. Do we want to do a question?
Sure, we can do that now. We've got, we've got a couple questions that have come in. We'll just handle those now. From Steve McGroarty, State of Alaska, we've got, what effect will repeated freeze-thaw cycles have on the performance of both moisture retention / evapotranspiration caps and infiltration barrier caps? Jim, you said you had some experience with that.
Well, no direct experience, except I've been to Siberia once.
Well,
and they at this particular diamond mine site, they had a particular problem that was kind of amazing. They built a dam without a clay cover, or without a clay core. They had soils that were very similar to clay, but they weren't perfectly impermeable, and they needed an impermeable core in this dam. And the way they did it is they used heat exchangers, which are nothing more than pipes capped, or enclosed pipes filled with kerosene as heat pumps. And what they did is they created a permafrost layer or permafrost zone in their dam, and that became the impermeable core. So to answer this gentleman's question in Alaska, I would say that the one thing that you would probably want to do would be to design your cover so that, if anything, you can generate a permanent permafrost zone over the cover, and I don't know how technically feasible that would be at his particular site. But if it's really very, very cold, that might be an alternative. If it's in some of the more temperate areas of, say, Alaska, then the infiltration barrier might be a better bet. But it's going to have to be some level of either of those two would be my first guess at how you'd address that situation. But try to use the natural situation that you have, freezing conditions, to solve your problem.
A second part of that question, I guess you could say a second part of that question would be, are there special design and construction considerations for both cap types in Arctic and subarctic climates?
I think we kind of talked about that a little bit. I would say, as part of the design, and again, designing for closure, you should know these things in advance. You know, what is the depth of permafrost, and how can you establish it quickly and make that situation work for you.
Okay. Well, I hope we answered that question. And there's another question that's come in from Kulip Kun Kun. I hope I haven't damaged that name too badly. Would you please discuss the ratio of carbonate material in the waste rock pile to determine whether the material is acid generating? And Harry's going to handle that.
Sure. Who sent that in?
I'll let you try and read it.
Well, thank you for sending in that question. We appreciate it. And we won't insult you by trying to pronounce your name. Not because of your name, but because of your handwriting. There is a diagram that I just threw over on the Elmo that might help out with this. On the vertical axis, I've shown in crude words here the acid production potential, and then on the horizontal axis, I've shown the base potential or the neutralization potential. And then I just threw on a couple of lines. Above that tall line, you might say that things are net acid generating, and then below the lower line, you'd say they're net neutralizing or net acid neutralizing. And that center zone is a zone of question. Now, depending on what state you're in or what your regulatory requirements are, the actual ratios along each of those lines can vary. So to be safe, first of all, of course, you want to look at the regulations and see what they might require. But then I think you'd want to hark back to the things that Kim Lepaco said much earlier about the actual amounts of carbonate, neutralizing carbonates, not all carbonates, but just the neutralizing carbonates, and then also the amount of sulfide present. And you'd want to consider the grain size, and doing the actual testing is really what you're looking for here. In some cases, I think those ratios, some of the published examples are like 3 to 1 is clearly acid generating, or three parts carbonate to 1 part sulfide. Some people would consider to be acid generating, but it really does depend on the actual situation and in the field, and your test results are going to give you the best estimate.
This might be a good case for more detailed kinetic testing.
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, the regs can't cover every single situation, so it really does fall back to the testing.
Yep. Well, Jim?
Well, shall we continue with...
carry on.
Now we're going to start looking at some treatment options here. In the active treatment of ARD, there are 3 main methods: chemical addition, filtration, and ion exchange. And lime dosing is probably the most common, but chemical addition, but it has problems with respect to hard rock mining ARD, which especially that contain multiple metals, as you'll see in a minute. But lime dosing relies on the neutralization of the ARD acidity and the subsequent precipitation of metal hydroxide compounds, which need to be filtered out. That's where the filtering comes in. The lime dosing filtering technique is the workhorse of active treatment, for it can typically mitigate a good percentage of the ARD characteristics. But the more stringent the effluent standard, the more likely that other polishing techniques like ion exchange or reverse osmosis will need to be used to achieve acceptable discharge quality. These other techniques can be quite expensive due to being labor-intensive and power-intensive, but in some situations, they may be the best alternative. So each mine site is unique. Now, one of the drawbacks of conventional lime dosing is the creation of iron hydroxide and gypsum sludge that is very difficult to dewater. Sludge is about 3% to 5% solids. It's about typical. This effect can be counteracted to some extent by adding lime and recirculating a portion of the treated water to achieve better particulate settling and sludge characteristics. This type of system is sometimes referred to as a high-density sludge, or an HDS system. The sludge generated here has a solids content ranging from 10% to 25%. This flowchart on the screen shows a general layout of an HDS system. The circulating load of the sludge provides a seed material to grow larger particles when they are that are easier to dewater. We take a little bit of the settling pond underflow and circulate it back into the sludge conditioning tank. So this provides kind of some seed material and allows the sludge to be easier to dewater. Now, this system works well for precipitating iron, but when other metals such as copper, lead, or zinc are present, a problem arises, as we'll see in a minute. So let's take a look at a lime dosing treatment plant. It's typical of an active treatment facility in that it's a fully staffed 24/7, consumes a lot of chemical reagents, and produces a non-hazardous gypsum iron hydroxide sludge that needs to be dewatered. The lime is usually stored in the silos that are shown here. And then the lime is added in to the ARD in a mixing tank, which is shown here. The resulting mixture of iron hydroxide and water is fed to a sludge thickener shown here. This is in the foreground. At some locations, this sludge needs further dewatering with filter presses. But at this site, the clarified overflow from the sludge thickener is fed to a holding pond that doubles as a trout farm. And here you can see on the screen it's a a feeding frenzy of oversized trout that have escaped from the fingerling holding pens. But there's a rub to all of this. This graph on the screen now shows the relative solubility of metal hydroxide precipitates on the y-axis as a function of solution pH on the x-axis. Now, if we have ARD comprised of several different metals, say aluminum, copper, and cadmium, we may have trouble meeting the effluent standard for all three of them. As the lime we add raises the pH, the aluminum will reach a low minimum solubility at about 0.002 milligrams per liter at about pH of 6. Now, if more lime is added and we raise the pH further, we'll start dropping out the copper, and it'll drop down to a really low value at about pH 8.7. However, at this pH, the aluminum that we precipitated before is now starting to come and be redissolved to an estimated concentration of about 0.7 milligrams per liter. And as you might guess, the situation gets even worse if we try to remove cadmium. Then you start redissolving both aluminum and copper, and this really complicates the situation. And having even more metals or other metals present could cause even more trouble. So, and the redissolution problem can be exacerbated. Now, there are other precipitants available that can get around this problem, especially sodium sulfide. But the labor, power, and reagent intensiveness of active treatment combine to make it a typically costly treatment alternative. We'll now consider another treatment method. Passive treatment is defined as the sequential ecological extraction of metals in a man-made but a naturalistic biosystem. What this means is that no one treatment cell type does everything. Different cell types might need to be employed in sequence to remove various metals. For example, one cell might take out iron, copper, lead, and zinc, and a subsequent cell might take out manganese. It's ecological because biological activity is typically involved. And lastly, it needs to include the extraction or filtering of precipitates that are formed. Otherwise, they'd be flushed through the system and the treatment effect would be lost. Recall that the same requirement applies to both active and passive treatment systems. And these systems are usually designed to work for decades without power or any additional chemicals. Only minor maintenance is needed. But let's take a look at the technique a little bit more closely. Geochemically, there are two zones that form in a natural wetland ecosystem. The aerobic zone, near the surface, where oxidizing reactions like iron hydrolysis occur, and the anaerobic zone beneath it that is dominated by reducing reactions like sulfate reduction. These naturally occurring geochemical zones compete against each other, and a given horizon may switch from one zone to the other if the water levels fluctuate. Thus, metal precipitates that may have formed could actually be redissolved and remobilized when the geochemical conditions are varied. And this is what it looks like in the real world. The orange stain is iron hydroxide that formed in the upper inch or so of this cell, and the black material, right in here, was dredged up from below the aerobic zone in the oxygen-depleted anaerobic zone. The plants in this situation increase the oxygen concentration in the upper zone of the cell, which increases the aerobic conditions suitable for iron precipitation. We talked a lot about that earlier. So thus, in natural situations, what we find is that all possible geochemical reactions in wetland environments are balanced, and the metal removal efficiencies can vary as the various zones compete for supremacy. In contrast, constructed wetland, quote-unquote, passive treatment system designs emphasize a single geochemical process in each cell to remove selected contaminants. This is the philosophy behind the sequential aspect of sequential ecological extraction we just discussed earlier. Despite the biological facets of passive treatment, standard geochemical reactions play a big role in how passive treatment systems work to remove metals. This first equation, which you've seen already, shows the reaction of iron and water called hydrolysis to form iron hydroxide. I think we called it rust earlier, and sometimes it's called yellow boy. Note that the 3 hydrogen ions are produced in this reaction right here. So what's going to happen? Right, the pH will drop from the increased hydrogen ion concentration as this reaction proceeds to completion or reaches equilibrium. The second reaction shown below represents the dissolution of limestone or calcium carbonate to form the bicarbonate ion. This is the same reaction that occurs in your stomach when you take an antacid tablet, which is typically made of calcium carbonate. But if we can add this bicarbonate ion to the water before the iron hydrolyzes up here, we can maintain the pH at a high level, or actually buffer the solution. These are the 2 reactions that are the cornerstone of aerobic passive treatment cells, especially for precipitating iron. But it doesn't do anything for the precipitation of copper or any of the other heavy metals like lead or zinc or cadmium or mercury. For that, we need another set of equations. These 2 equations are the heart of how we get these other heavy metals to drop out. The top reaction is facilitated by the sulfate-reducing bacteria, or SRB. The sulfate in the mine water combines with an organic carbon source, shown here. These are the nutrients that the SRB need to live. The sulfate is typically supplied by the ARD itself, and it's rarely in short supply. And the organic source must be provided for in the design. And this organic source is typically comprised of cellulose-type materials such as sawdust, wood chips, or hay. Both the products of this reaction are beneficial for treating ARD. The bicarbonate ion, remember that one? We just talked about that in limestone dissolution. This raises the pH, and the sulfide ion, here, this ion is available to combine with the heavy metals down below, in this case it's zinc, to form insoluble metal sulfide precipitates as shown down below. This is actually the reaction for the formation of sphalerite. And you can substitute for this zinc ion here, you can substitute lead, copper, cadmium, mercury, iron in the second equation and form the commensurate the mineral on the other side. Now, aluminum is a topic for an advanced class. So you might be asking yourself, where do I buy the cookbook that shows me how to design these systems? Well, there's no cookbook yet, and the best I can offer at this point is the ADTI handbook that's currently under peer review. We may be 10 to 20 years from that point, despite the fact that many engineers still rely on early cookbook-style relationships published by the U.S. Bureau of Mines nearly 10 years ago. But the situation isn't as bleak as it sounds. We found that there are 2 major aspects that influence design of a passive treatment system. The geochemistry of the AMD, what metals are present, and in what oxidation states. What's the mineral and the pH the pH and the mineral acidity. These will decide which cell type and the sequencing while they would be employed. And secondly, what is the metal loading? Now, this design parameter is directly related to retention time. Everybody says, well, what's the retention time in these cells? And it's going to be a function of how fast the metals are being fed to it. For the higher the metal loading, the higher the retention time needs to be to provide effective treatment. Thus, both surface area and the cell depth will be a function of metal loading because they'll influence retention time. This is an important concept for you to remember and why prevention measures are so important to lower the loading value, because it helps to lower the size of the passive treatment system needed. So, how do we take these concepts and physically apply them on the ground? Here's a list of some of the cell types that engineers use to create geochemical conditions favorable for metals precipitation. There are 2 major types. The ones on the left are biologically based. That is, they use bacteria-facilitated reactions as the primary means of treatment. The cells on the right are limestone-based cell types that rely on limestone dissolution and acidity neutralization reactions to provide treatment. Now, settling ponds and equalization ponds down the bottom are the filtering and water management components, respectively, and they're a big part of the equation. Now, we don't have enough time here to provide design criteria for each of these, but we can provide some guidance as to which ones are the most appropriate for given situations. Now, remember, calculate the loading. You're going to need it to design these cells, but what kind of cells do you need? Let's just say for what I'd call fair to good quality ARD, which is, it might have iron and manganese only, and say low aluminum and net alkaline, low acidity. You can probably get by using oxidation and neutralization processes like aerobic cells and settling ponds and other limestone-based cells that are listed here. Now, arsenic in small amounts can be handled by these cell types if you do have enough iron present. But if you have heavy metals like copper, lead, and zinc, you need to go to something else like sulfate reduction. To give you an idea of what an aerobic cell looks like, here you can see iron precipitating in a cattail-dominated cell, but there are probably other biota here like grasses, sedges, and algae that are doing a lot of the same things. But what if you've got really nasty ARD? And by nasty, I mean heavy metals, low pH, say less than 4, less than 3, more than 5 milligrams per liter of aluminum, and high mineral acidity. The sulfate-reducing bacteria cell with an aerobic polishing cell tops the list in this situation. That's this one. You precipitate the metals as sulfide and polish the SRB cell effluent with an aerobic cell. In some cases, you might want to consider limestone-dominated systems, but they might not be enough They might not be enough to provide the results that you need. Here's a schematic cross-section of a sulfate-reducing bacteria cell, which can work even in winter conditions as long as you keep the water moving through the organic matter in the limestone substrate mixture. Flow is typically by gravity and from the top downward. The treated water is collected in the bottom and is discharged out the side. We show a free water surface on this particular cell here, but the top of the cell might even be buried beneath a soil cover to protect it during winter conditions. So, where do we get the sulfate-reducing bacteria, you may ask? Fortunately, there are plenty of, they are pretty common and found in the intestinal tracts of many domestic animals. The most reliable sources of these bugs are cattle manure, but we've used all kinds of sources for constructing SRB cells, including chicken, horse, and turkey manure, which is more foul-smelling than chicken manure. I hope you caught that pun. Fortunately, composting helps to control the odors, but doesn't affect the SRB. At one site, we used a mixture of manure sources from the county fair, kind of a potpourri source of SRB. Now, all fecal jokes aside, these bugs are important to the functioning of sulfate-reducing cells, and they thrive best in an environment with a pH above 5.5, but can handle water with its lower pH if it's fed to them slowly enough. And that's part of the design process, figuring out the best way to keep these bugs happy. We've found that a phased design approach greatly reduces the risk of failure. It allows for better understanding of treatment cell interactions, especially when they're in sequence. And it's especially helpful to make mistakes on a small scale rather than have to apologize to the local citizens over system underperformance or request funding to study or fix a system that never worked right from the start. Now, the phases start in the lab, progress to bench scale, and then to pilot scale, and maybe even with some full-scale modules, finally to full-scale design. Now, one drawback of this approach is that it takes more time before the full-scale system becomes reality. But in the meantime, we can conduct characterization studies to quantify anticipated system loading that can be completed so that the final system is properly sized to the situation. You can go out and collect more data. Now, much money and face are saved in the long run using this approach. So, what does it involve? The first phase tests whether the geochemical principles will work with the available construction materials. These are static tests to evaluate initial geochemical process feasibility. Some tests take a day, others take up to 6 weeks. Here are some examples of sulfate-reducing tests using bottle containers. We've also used plastic bags. Now these tests are low cost, on the order of $10,000 for a complete set, and offer the opportunity to test a wide variety of potential construction materials. The bench scale test is the next phase. This can be a field test, or it can be conducted in a lab if it's easier to bring the ARD there. Bench tests typically take 3 months or more. Now it's a dynamic test with flowing water. We typically use 5 or 6 cells to evaluate various mixes of substrate components and include different cell types and sequence as shown in this slide. The construction materials, as you can see, are pretty simple. In this case, we use off-the-shelf trash cans and plastic barrels cut in half. And the bench results provide the basis of the pilot test design. In this case, we've used earthen embankments, steel tanks, backyard swimming pools. This one was on sale for $632.50. It was at the end of the summer. We've used a lot of different materials for cost-effective pilot cell containment structures. Here are examples of both anaerobic and aerobic cells from a variety of sites and conditions. As you can see, these tests are definitely not high-tech. Most of the time, they're managed by on-site or client personnel. The test is typically run for 6 months to a year, but especially through the winter season, because sulfate reduction rates do slow down in the winter, and you need to get a handle on how slow they do slow down. But once performance is established, the system's response to overloading can be evaluated. In one case, we were able to ramp up to twice the design flow of a 25 gallon per minute pilot cell and operate there for a month before any effects on the cell performance was observed. This is very important when you think about overloading in the full-scale system. The pilot test results are used for designing the full-scale system. Now in this case, this is a 1,200 gallon per minute system in Missouri that's been operating since 1996. It's going to be 6 years old this June, treating 1 part per million of lead in mine water down to a discharge limit of less than 30 parts per billion. And the entire system fits in a 5-acre footprint and costs about $700,000 to design, permit, and construct. The operating cost for this system is about 4 cents per 1,000 gallons. The active treatment alternative was at least $1 million to construct and $1 million a year to operate. So this thing paid for itself very, very quickly. But you may run into some special treatment cases in the field that don't exactly qualify as active or passive treatment. One situation involves water-powered delivery systems for lime, limestone, or caustic. These are commercially available off-the-shelf units that are typically installed upstream of a settling pond. I term them semi-passive because they don't really need power or an operator, but you do need to keep the reagent supply topped off periodically. The treatment of pit lakes with reagents is another situation that's a little different. Both caustic and organic materials have been used to successfully treat pit lakes. The big question is longevity, and is it going to be driven, and it will be driven by the geochemistry of the pit walls above the water line. So to help preserve the effects of the in-pit treatment on the long term, some disruption of the ARD tetrahedron in the exposed pit walls will probably be needed. I've listed a few of the design considerations for these situations, but the list is far from complete. Well, we've discussed active treatment, passive treatment, and special treatment of ARD, but you might also consider all of the above. Combination systems like the ones outlined here might be the best approach at a given site. However, once all the prevention measures have been implemented and to reduce loading, you may find that a simple passive treatment system might be all that you need. Remember our exercise on loading that was earlier. Here are a number of websites you might want to visit for more information. If you're looking for papers or references on a specific topic, go to the Knight Peasold website first for a really slick searchable database that has all the paper titles, authors, and keywords for a lot of the American Society for Mining and Reclamation and the International Conference on Acid Rock Drainage conference proceedings. And we can help you get a hard copy if you need one. So, what did we learn in the treatment segment? You can treat ARD either actively or passively, and using a phase design approach of lab, bench, and pilot tests can significantly lower the risk. In this way, you tend to make mistakes on a small scale. And you need to know the ARD chemistry and the loading to size the treatment system. Thanks for your attention. That was a lot of ground to cover in a short time. And hopefully when you encounter ARD on your next projects, you'll think first about, number one, how to prevent it by disrupting the ARD tetrahedron, and then consider the geochemistry of the ARD when you're collecting and containing it, and lastly, that the treatment systems will be sized based on the loading and the geochemistry of the water. If you have additional questions, you can email me or give me a call. And Dave, back to you.
Thanks, Jim. As you said, that's a lot of ground to cover, and I think that's an excellent presentation. At this point, we're going to take a break. If you've got questions, I'd certainly encourage you to fax material in while we're on break so that we can perhaps make sure the right people are here to answer it in the next session. This is our last break of the day, so we'll take 15 minutes, and when we pick back up, we're going to talk about bonding, mine closure, and if we've got any factors that come in, we'll work on those. So stay tuned. We'll see you in 15 minutes.